Once upon a time, nestled in the heart of a lush green valley, was a peaceful village. The villagers were simple folk, tending to their crops, caring for their animals, and living in harmony with the land. But one day, a great shadow fell over the village, and that shadow belonged to none other than a giant. The giant, tall as the tallest tree and strong as a mountain, came down from the hills to the north. His footsteps shook the ground, and the wind carried his deep, booming laughter as he approached the village. The villagers trembled in fear, hiding in their homes, praying that the giant would pass them by. But the giant had no intention of leaving the village in peace. For weeks, the giant terrorized the village. He would stomp through the fields, crushing crops under his enormous feet. He'd rip the roofs off houses, scattering the villagers' belongings, and he even stole their food, devouring entire feasts in a single bite. The villagers grew desperate. They could not continue living like this. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, the village elders gathered in the town square. They knew they had to act, but no one knew how to stop a giant. Some suggested fleeing to the next valley, but others knew that the giant would follow wherever they went. It was then that a young girl named Lyra spoke up. "Why don't we use our minds instead of our strength?" she suggested. The elders, though skeptical, asked her to explain. Lyra was not the strongest in the village, nor was she the oldest or most experienced, but she was clever. She had spent her days observing the giant from a distance, noting his every move, and now she had an idea. "The giant may be big and strong, but he is also greedy," she explained. "He loves our food, especially our bread. What if we use that to our advantage?" The elders listened closely as Lyra laid out her plan. They decided it was worth a try, for they had nothing to lose. The next morning, the villagers began to bake. Every family worked together to make the largest loaf of bread they could manage, and by midday, they had created a mountain of bread, big enough to feed the giant. They placed it in the center of the village, just as the giant approached from the hills. When the giant arrived, he sniffed the air and smiled, his massive nose twitching. "Ah! What a feast!" he bellowed. "At last, these tiny villagers have learned to respect me." He reached down, scooping up the bread and stuffing it into his mouth. But what the giant didn't know was that Lyra and the villagers had mixed a special ingredient into the dough, a sleeping potion made from herbs that grew in the nearby forest. It was powerful enough to knock out even a giant. As the giant finished his meal, he swayed on his feet. "Why, do I feel so tired?" he mumbled, before collapsing with a thunderous crash in the middle of the village square, fast asleep. The villagers cheered, but they knew the job wasn't finished. They had to make sure the giant wouldn't wake up and terrorize them again. Lyra had anticipated this too. "We need to trap him somewhere he can't escape," she said. "Let's build a cage in the valley below, where the river bends. The land there is soft, and with enough effort, we can dig a deep pit." For days, the villagers worked tirelessly. They dug a massive pit in the valley, reinforced with wooden beams and heavy rocks. Then, with the help of their strongest oxen and ropes, they dragged the sleeping giant to the pit and lowered him inside. When he awoke, he was trapped, unable to climb out or break free. The giant roared and thrashed, but the walls of the pit were too high and too sturdy. The villagers stood at the edge, watching as the giant, once so fearsome, could do nothing but sit in defeat. "You have been outsmarted, giant," Lyra called down to him. "You may be big and strong, but we are many, and together we are stronger." From that day on, the giant remained in the pit, unable to escape. The villagers returned to their peaceful lives, no longer living in fear. They tended to their fields, rebuilt their homes, and never forgot the lesson they had learned, that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in muscles, but in the mind. As for Lyra, she became a hero in the village, known far and wide for her cleverness and courage. The villagers celebrated her wisdom every year, telling the tale of how a young girl outwitted a fearsome giant, bringing peace back to their valley. And so, The giant never troubled the village again, and the people lived happily ever after. The end.